This week on Gravel, Andrew tells us about the relationship that he and his children have developed with a tree. Demitri is a tree that you want to know. He's a little bit gruesome, but he's a little bit cool. So we're going to talk about that. We talk about how state wildlife agencies are kind of structured and how they work. And Bronson goes off on some crazy right-wing tangent. We thought we were listening to Rush Limbaugh, but it's only on Gravel.
Well, welcome back to On Gravel. This is getting to be kind of a regular meeting of the minds. Good afternoon, gents. This is Andrew McKean. Who else is on?
Well, Ryan Bronson is live from Minnesota.
And this is Eric Digger coming to you from Lincoln, Nebraska.
Well, it is a beautiful day, not to be, kind of your afternoon drive companions, but it's a beautiful autumn afternoon in eastern Montana. Deer season is on, elk season is going, antelope season's on. This is the time to live for.
Pretty exciting. You've got some news, Mr. McKean, of all of those sorts, don't you? Deer, antelope, elk living on someone's property?
Oh, yeah, so the biggest news of my week, I guess, is I moved. It's been years upon years in the making, but we finally sold our house. We've been building a house for, as my neighbor says, you got 2 grain crops into that house, and it's coming up on a third. That's kind of the prairie annuli, is how many grain crops do you have in by the time you get your house built. But we're living in it now, even though we're still camping because the house is not finished, but we were going to be homeless if we didn't just move in. The coolest thing about it is where it is located. I can glass deer from my back porch and then just slip on my boots and go hunt without ever starting an engine. So 0 carbon footprint for my hunting season. And it's been fun, actually. This morning I saw a buck that I was pretty interested in and tried to find him. I couldn't find him, but it was fun to just walk out of my house and be hunting.
That's pretty special. Pretty cool.
Well, I don't want to be outdone, because I'm in the process of buying a new house, and I don't have any elk, and I don't have any pronghorn, but I've got black squirrels running all over this neighborhood that I'm soon to be moving into. So I've got my own trophy animals, in the suburbs of the southeastern, Twin Cities. So it's not just glorious Montana where you can get some cool stuff.
Can you shoot them though? I mean, is there any sort of city limit ordinance? Like, I got to ask.
What are you?
Is this like a blowgun opportunity? What's the deal?
There's a discharge ordinance in the city, so no, I would not be allowed to shoot them. But look, I can enjoy wildlife that I don't shoot too. That's part of my role as a conservationist.
I'll just add this. One of the members of this podcast, who shall remain nameless, has a black squirrel at the taxidermist right now. Don't know exactly where that person got that squirrel exactly, but I bet none of you have a mounted black squirrel, do you? Not yet anyways, until your or my squirrel gets back from the taxidermist.
I have shot a couple. My dad has one mounted, but I've never mounted one.
What?
Yeah.
Here, I thought I was being innovative. I mean, whoever had the squirrel was being innovative.
I got one too, I hate to tell you.
Serious?
Yeah, I got it right behind the ear.
God.
Well, that poses an important squirrel hunting question, because I'm from a family where you are not allowed to use shotguns. You have to shoot them with a .22. So a headshot through the ear is really the optimal shot. So how did the person who got this black squirrel, who remained nameless, how did they get their squirrel?
Squirrel trap.
Wait, you're mounting a live trapped squirrel?
I heard. I don't know who this person is you're talking about, but
I think the vice is squeezing you a little hard here. And I intend to put a little more torque on this.
Don't we have some topics we were going to try and cover today?
Did you at least squirrel rope it? I mean, as a confirmed gopher roper, did you catch it with a string?
Again, no idea who you're talking about. It's just.
And what did you
something I
like
heard.
asphyxiate it with like the tailpipe of the Subaru? Like,
Yeah, the Dinger family Subaru.
how did you dispatch this thing?
Well, first of all, if I had a Subaru, that would be a fantastic way to dispatch something, because a dented Subaru just adds to its legend, I think. I don't know how this person may or may not have this. Maybe it went live to the taxidermist to maybe help the taxidermist training of his squirrel dog. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to say, really.
Did you pith it?
I wasn't there. I have no idea. Pith.
Huh.
That's not a word I've heard since 8th grade biology when we pithed a frog. But I have pithed a few birds since then. I didn't know it was a thing before that, but it is a good way, versus wringing their neck or something.
It's a really underutilized word.
It really is.
Well, could you define
I feel like I just pithed this podcast with my squirrel legend.
So give us the Webster's definition of pithed.
Pith, I would guess, means to poke with a sharp object. I don't know that, but to pith something in 8th grade biology class meant that you would pull the frog's head forward so that you could get under its skull and stick a sharp object through the back of its neck so it would die instantly. And I know there's a company that makes something for bird hunting that's the same. You put it on your lanyard when you're goose hunting or duck hunting, and it's a pith for a bird. Have you seen those?
It's better than using the duck commander Phil Robertson technique of biting the back of their head.
Yeah, that's definitely better. Definitely better. Andrew, aren't you going to tell us a story about a tree on your property?
Could you lead me any more nose ringish to that?
For
topic?
the love of God.
So I was writing a little bit about this for my McKean Minute, which you can read on powderhook.com earlier today, because I think I've noted in previous episodes, we are in a CWD surveillance area. This part of the state is trying to figure out if CWD exists, and if it does, what kind of prevalence. And so hunters are being asked to submit heads of deer and elk, but mostly deer, whitetail, mule deer, to be tested for CWD. And part of that is, and I intend to have every deer that my family takes tested, just to be part of the solution, I guess. The other thing that we're going to do that's going to be really different is just try to kind of obey all the best practices of dealing with CWD, which is disposing of butchered carcasses in a sanitary landfill, which just feels really weird to me. I've just always been of the mind that I want to return the organics to the place they came, to just complete the circle of life. And what I was writing about is there's a little bit of a mythology about this in my immediate family. Years and years ago, we would, before my kids could hunt, they would help me butcher, and then we would take a little trip down to this tree out in a pasture. This big old spreading willow tree just stands all alone out there, and we would throw the carcasses back into the landscape underneath that tree. And so I started saying, hey kids, let's go feed the meat tree. We just would call it the meat tree. And even if we were hiking or whatever, working cows or something around there, we just pointed out that was known as the meat tree. Well, it turns out my kids thought I was calling the tree by the name Demitri. And so they've always called it Demitri. And that's kind of now a landmark. Oh yeah, I saw, there's a beaver dam in the creek right underneath Demitri. Or, yeah, there was a deer that ran by Demitri. And it grieves me a little bit, not only to be packaging now my butchered deer as biohazard waste that now goes to a sanitary landfill with old soup cans and dirty diapers, but it also means that we can't feed Demitri anymore. And that, I don't know, it's just taken a little bit of polish off the season, but it's the right thing to do, is to not spread these possibly contaminated carcasses around the landscape. So Demitri is going to get hungry. Oh, and by the way, it was also a pretty good place to see coyotes under Demitri later in the season.
What else are we going to talk about? That's a pretty fascinating story. Bronson, do you have a place on your place that you've always dumped your deer?
We do, and I haven't made the same decision that Andrew has, where we're going to stop doing that. In part because we're not in a CWD endemic zone yet. Hopefully, I'm hoping and praying that we never become endemic where we're at. But yeah, we've got a rock pile out 150 yards from one of our only deer stands that we have on a field on kind of on the edge of our property, but not off of our property. That's traditionally where we've always dumped our deer legs and the rib cages and things. A couple of years ago, we started getting a little bit more aggressive about trimming out and trying to avoid putting anything out there that was shot up at all, just because we've been seeing eagles feeding on that pile as well occasionally, and so we try to minimize the potential exposure that an eagle might get from having some lead particles from bullets, because that's one of the things we can do as hunters, just to minimize potential downstream problems. But yeah, we've done it for years, and we always do it with this intention that then we'll go and hunt coyotes over that, but we never do. We never hunt. We shoot coyotes, but we never shoot them over that meat pile. But we've got several years. I've got a couple spots out in the Dakotas where I hunt ducks, where that's where we always clean our birds, and they're always cleaned up the next day when we go back, which are so I've got traditional dumping spots, but I hope that I don't have to end that tradition. Chronic wasting disease is a real kick in the gut if it's going to affect hunting in ways like that. How about you, Dinger? Do you butcher your own deer?
I do butcher my own deer, much to the chagrin of my neighbors. In fact, one of my neighbors, I'm pretty sure, won't talk to me because I hang my deer from the tree in my backyard. I live in Lincoln, which is a fairly urban area. And at least 3 or 4 houses, maybe 5, can see into my backyard. And yeah, every year there's a deer hanging there for a couple days. And I'm pretty sure that my closest neighbor to that tree won't speak to me. And it started about the time of me hanging deer and them walking out their back door and looking at me like I was maybe disposing of a human body or something. But I'd never had heard the idea of bringing the bones back to nature. We'd always just throw them in the trash. And so it's a great thought. We might start doing that. So I guess maybe not this year. I think we're in a CWD watch zone too. So maybe I've been doing it right all along on accident.
So why do you hang it?
Man, I wish I could give you because it helps the meat. And honestly, the last few years I've hung them because I get home from deer hunting at night and then hang the deer because you got to put it somewhere. And then usually I have to work the next day or something. So I need to put it somewhere until I can get back home to cut it up. So I wish I could say I hung it because of wanting to age the meat, but it's a shady spot in the backyard that stays pretty cool. We have these great, big, beautiful old maple trees in our backyard. And so I've always just hung them there, frankly, so that my wife wouldn't get mad that they were hanging in the garage or some other place that she didn't want them. So I know a lot of guys. Do you guys hang your deer before you butcher them?
We used to, but back in the early 2000s when our deer population was really high and we were shooting, a dozen or more deer off our farm because each of us could shoot 5 each. That's what we were allowed to by the limits at the time. When we had so many deer, we just got in the habit. We have a couple fridges at the farm, and we would get the skin off right away. We'd break it down into quarters, and we would start butchering while we were still in camp. So we stopped hanging deer for a couple of days, like is the tradition for a lot of folks. I got to admit, I can't tell any decline in the quality of the meat. It seems just as good, just as tender, just as ever. And we just we try to get it done. We try to, if we can have deer butchered the same night we kill it, or sometime the next day, that's better. Now, we're not shooting as many deer. We probably could hang them, but we've got this tradition and we've got the efficiency where we get them all cut up as quickly as we can. That's kind of what we do. I don't know. How about you, Andrew?
I'm a little bit like Dinger in the sense that usually at the end of the day, I'm ready to hang my deer and not deal with it anymore. And so I actually have a little, I think it's a 48 horse little diesel tractor with a front end loader on it. And that's where just traditionally for the last, 15 years, that's where deer have hung. Our problem is, probably like yours, Bronson, is it can get pretty cold, and the world's worst thing is skinning a frozen deer. So,
oh man, that's hard.
I certainly don't mind hanging it for a day just to get the heat off of it, but sometimes there's not a ton of time before it freezes. So I don't hang it real long, but I definitely hang it before I butcher it. Now that I've been doing like for certain elk, and if I'm lucky enough to get a moose, bigger animals that I'm taking apart in the field, they're a little harder to hang, but I still will hang like meat bags just to make sure all the heat is out of them before I cut them up.
So one of the things that has changed for me since joining the outdoor industry is previously I worked in advertising in downtown Lincoln, brand development kind of stuff. And, the culture of being surrounded by other hunters was just not there for me. Most of the people I worked with were very much not into what I was into when work got out. And so I never really took much pride in cutting up my own game. I always took it to the butcher or to the game processor to have sticks made and jerky made. And most of the time, the people I worked with were very, very glad to see deer show up in that way in their lives. But after joining the industry, I started kind of paying more attention to how other avid hunters handle their post game, their post hunt process. And I'm probably this will be year 5 here of processing my own meat. I've done an elk, and otherwise I've always, even had a pheasant cleaning business as a kid, so it's never been something I'm afraid to do or didn't want to do, just didn't. And I have to tell you, the cutting up of something that you kill is a weird, maybe carnal even addition of joy to the whole process. Do you guys still feel that? Am I alone in that, or is that really a fun part for you guys too?
Oh, it's a fun part. I think it's a necessary part. I'm not going to lie, after my kids, I have 3 kids, all of whom hunt, all of whom have multiple tags. We can get a lot of, the carcass count can get pretty high. And I'm going to say the last deer of the season may not have the same joy as the first, but it's a pretty joyful process still. And my kids throw in, and we all kind of have a different job. I'm a little anal about clean meat and making sure that there's no hair on it or any sort of dirt. And it exasperates my kids just a little bit, but I think it's a critical sort of closure to the whole hunt. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing a big, we put the cut and wrap meat in a laundry basket before we put it in the freezer, and carrying a great big laundry basket out to the freezer, all of the packages with our names on them. Whoever is the hunter has their name on the package. We put the species, the date, and then some location that will remind us where it came from. So it's a pretty cool and satisfying thing to put into a freezer and then to take it out and cook. So it's satisfying.
Cool. Have you guys started to do I've seen some people, in fact, I think it's a very old tradition. I watched a video of some people hunting in Poland, and after they killed the animal, they put some of what the animal would have been eating in its mouth and kind of gave it Andrew, you can probably speak to that tradition. Do you guys forage any of the herbs from around where your deer was killed? Have you ever done that? I've never done it. I think it's kind of an interesting thought to how you could prep your deer, is to look around for dried or dead herbs. In our area, they'd be dead anyways, that you could use in preparing the meat. You ever done that?
No. And I don't know if Andrew knows much about European traditions. He doesn't go to Europe hunting anymore.
Oh man!
Oh, there's a dig. For the dear listener, I was supposed to be in Finland on a moose hunt this week, and I am not there. Instead, I'm with you, happily so. No, as close as I've come is kind of honoring the European tradition of maybe putting a little last morsel in the mouth, as kind of a send off to the afterlife of the animal. But I've never brought it out of the field with me.
What is that tradition, Andrew? Do you explain that, will you?
Last bite, which is a total McKeanization of last bite. Yeah, I mean, it's just that. It's a way to, I guess, to give back to the animal the life that you've taken, just a bit of its surroundings. And I don't know if it's sort of a Viking-esque, passage into the afterworld or afterlife, as much as it is just a way to memorialize the animal and really where it came from.
Lasta Vitae? Is that the name of the Mexican restaurant in Glasgow?
Salmonella so bad, this is your last Vitae.
Well, yeah, Dos Equis is just one X. Don't drink it. It's Uno Equis.
Una más, dos Equis. Speaking of Una más, the first hunt that Andrew and I ever went on down in Mexico, we were hunting turkeys down in Chihuahua, and one of our compadres, he thought he could speak Spanish, but by the end of the night, all he could say was una más, and he una más himself into one heck of a hangover the next day. And I ran into the outfitter, and he asked me how una más was doing. He couldn't remember his name, but he remembered that he went by una más for the rest of the hunt.
What a great nickname.
That's a good nickname. He earned it. So a good nickname that you earn. He was tagged out. He had gotten his 2 birds and was done hunting. So it was time for una más.
At some point I will dredge up one of the greatest photos I have of Bronson from that hunt. He's wearing vacation wear in the little sort of veranda of this rancho where we were staying, calling to the domestic gobbler in the courtyard, and the gobbler is all fanned out and responding. And at one point I have a shot of you with your shotgun aimed at the domestic gobbler as though it's coming in at full strike.
Yeah.
Can only imagine. I think I've been in similar scenarios with Bronson.
Well, and that all happened, I believe, when I was still on my Uno, the first one. First drink of the night was before dinner. But it was just hilarious. This white gobbler, he was gobbling his head off. So, I went out and practiced my calling.
Hey guys, I want you to explain something for us. One of the things that I didn't understand coming into the outdoor industry is exactly how a state fish and wildlife agency works. And what I mean by that is I, of course, knew that the game wardens, as we call them, or conservation officers, as some places call them, I knew they worked for the agency, and I knew the agency employed some biologists, and that's where we went to get our licenses. But the inner workings of why an agency exists and what it exists to do and things like that fascinate me. Ryan, would you mind talking a little bit about kind of how an agency makes money and why they were set up the way they were set up?
Well, there's a couple different general models. I mean, really, there's 50 different models. Every state's a little bit different, but there's 2 general models. One where the state wildlife agency essentially falls in the pecking order underneath the governor, where it's a state agency and the leadership of the agency is appointed by a governor. And so they all kind of roll up that chain. And then the other major model is where there's an independent commission that governs the wildlife agency, and they usually are the ones that are charged with hiring the director, and then the director is the chief staff, and so that the employees of that agency really report to the commission and not the governor's office. Those are the 2 basic models. but their funding is almost exclusively from three sources. Well, it's not almost, it's pretty much three sources. The first being license fees from hunting and fishing licenses are usually the major part of their budget. The other source that's really closely tied to that is the federal aid they get from the Pittman-Robertson and the Wallop-Rowe and the Dinkle-Johnson excise taxes on hunting equipment, or hunting guns, ammos, and archery gear, on fishing gear, and on boats and things. So that's the second source of funding. And then there are a few states that get some funding from the general fund, from the general taxpayers, coming from sales tax or income taxes collected in those states. States that have pretty small hunter bases, the more urbanized states, they're the ones that tend to require more funding to come from the general taxpayers. But places like Montana, Wyoming, like most of the western states with huge hunting traditions, Minnesota, where I'm at, Nebraska, where you're at, almost exclusively their funding is coming from the fees paid by hunters and the taxes paid on guns, ammo, archery gear, and fishing equipment. So that's almost where almost all the funding comes from. And regulations are, the things that they implement as an agency are usually set either by their legislature or by that wildlife commission that oversees them. And they make the regulations, they make the rules, they do the season setting per statute, and so it can be complicated. I'm dealing with that right now, where I've got a situation where in the state of Illinois, I'm trying to get some regulations changed to allow small shot, because my employer, Federal Premium Ammunition, has got 410 loads and some other things that use really fine tungsten super shot. And what I'm finding is that in the state of Illinois, I've got regulations that have been made by the agency through their commission rulemaking process that restrict the gauges, and then other statutes that were made by the legislature that govern what shot sizes are allowed. And so in order to get the regulations that would make my products legal, I need to get both the administrative rules changed and the statute changed. And that's extremely complicated, and that's on the extreme. But so there's a spectrum of states that out there that run the gamut in how they manage things.
So in some ways, the setting up of a commission separate from the governor's office and separate from the legislature was a stroke of genius and fairly unique as a model to manage wildlife in the United States. Talk for a bit, if you would, Ryan, about why that's important that it's separate, and maybe why they did it in the beginning and why it remains that way, and why that could be important to an animal versus a person.
I've got a positive spin on that, and then I've got a cynical view on that, both, and I think both are a little bit true for different states. But in a lot of states, natural resources, they wanted professional management, and so they set up a commission that was kind of outside of the normal political spheres, so that these commissions are appointed maybe by the governor, but the term staggered, and so that there was never a partisan element to how the wildlife agencies were supposed to be managed, and they were supposed to be more professional that way. The cynical part of me thinks that the reason that some of these persist today is that legislators in some places just don't really care about hunting and fishing issues. They don't want to engage, so. And we know that's true. There are places where there isn't much engagement from state legislatures or the regular governance or the governor's office on wildlife issues. But then if you're in a state that's got a really strong, robust commission system that has really well engaged commissioners that have the interests of sportsmen and wildlife both in mind, it can be really good. I think the fear that some people have for commission systems is that if you start appointing, because they're separate and there isn't any political partisanship connected to it, if you have a series of governors that start appointing non-hunting or anti-hunting members to these commissions can really wreak havoc on the hunting and fishing mode that we use in the United States. So I think people that have some concerns about that, that there's risk there. But let's face it, as sportsmen, we're at risk whether our state agency is run by a commission or whether it's a political agency run by the governor. It,
Sure.
we just have to always be engaged because, we represent a minority of the population in the U.S. Hunters are, 5-10% of the population these days. We're at risk of like any minority population, where the majority, if they don't like what you're doing, could potentially use the power of our democratic system to take things away. So that's why I think it's really important for hunters to be engaged, not only with their state legislatures and in the partisan politics, but also with wildlife commissions, so that they know that they're communicating sound science and the values that need to be promoted that we all embrace as hunters.
Sure. One of the things that, and by no means am I the expert on all this, but one of the things I thought was brilliant as a sort of a newbie to the concept was the idea that deer don't vote. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the economic imperative or the purpose of government in many ways is to administer a tax and then provide services in return for that tax. And people, humans, are demanding of more and more services. We want better roads. Roads cost more money than they ever have. We want healthcare. We want, pick anything that your state government does for humans. We almost always want more money to do more of that. And in many cases, the decisions we would make to create more dollars would be things like annexing additional property into the city, or building paved roads out into places we didn't have to pull in a manufacturing facility, or to pull, wires and plumbing out to a new development. And the thing about that is each time we make those decisions, we take habitat away from wild game. And one of the things that I think is brilliant about the model of managing animals and wild places in this way is some of those decisions meet resistance because of the style of management that we've chosen. Whereas if animal privileges and rights and abilities were set up against the rights and privileges and the abilities of humans, I think we would constantly be looking at a government that was prioritizing people over animals, which probably makes sense, but to the detriment of something that had no say in it. And so I think that's a fascinating part of the concept of agencies in general, is that somebody's got to represent the wild animals and wild places in these conversations. And if my job is to increase my tax base, a great way to do that is to turn CRP into cornfields and turn wetlands into strip malls. That's a great way to increase my tax base. And as government officials, you probably have the economic imperative to look at doing things like that. And the one thing that stands in the way consistently is a Fish and Wildlife Agency in some ways. So I thought that was a pretty cool finding that, frankly, I just didn't know coming into it.
Deer don't vote, but I want to emphasize that Eric Dinger doesn't think that animals should have rights either, right?
I mean, if companies have rights, I don't know. No, I don't believe that. I don't believe that the squirrels should vote. Though in Nebraska, we did just get a proposal for 16-year-olds to vote in front of our unicameral legislature.
I heard that on Minnesota Public Radio today. They, all the liberals thought that was a great idea. Now, I'm fairly politically conservative, and so my political philosophy on the role of government is much, much more limited than I think is probably what a lot of people think. I don't look at government to do services. I think government's primary role is to provide that set of fairness and rules so that everyone can operate together equally and fairly. That's the primary role. And then those services that can't be provided otherwise, like roads. But when we look at wildlife, I say this as a fairly conservative person. When we look at wildlife, we have this philosophy in the United States that wildlife are held in the public trust, that they belong to the people. They don't belong to the government, they belong to the people, and that the government is tasked with managing them in a way that benefits all of us. And so I look at that, and then I balance that with the fact that, my Christian beliefs, where we have a responsibility as sentient beings in this world to be stewards of the world, of the earth. I believe we have a responsibility as Christians and as citizens, to be stewards, to manage wildlife, to protect wild places, because they're part of God's creation just as much as shopping malls and churches are. So those are the big philosophical things. But if we start getting into those kinds of topics, Eric, we're going to completely bore our listeners, I
think. Maybe this is the kind of thing you need a whiskey to consume. I don't know. So, hey, we're bumping up against time here, and we're going to introduce something new to the On Gravel podcast. We're going to welcome our first guest ever. And so, Andrew, take it away. It's all yours. Introduce your guest, and let's hear from him.
Well, we hope it works because we actually don't have this in the bag yet. So, barring any sort of technical difficulties or laryngitis, we're going to hear from Chris Johnsrud, who's one of my oldest friends. And he's pursuing, I think, at least what fascinates me as kind of the ultimate outdoorsman, almost kind of man skill. He's committed himself to making knives. He's kind of toyed with the idea and little samples here and there, but he's actually kind of going into business for it. It's not at all sort of a pitch for his business. Instead, we're going to find out what it takes to be a knife maker. How do you get started? How do you go through all the processes? So he's got a sonorous voice and he's got a good story to tell, and I think it'll be fun to listen to. Well, hello there, On Gravelers. I am here with our very first guest ever. So we've never opened our doors to other people, but you're the first, Chris Johnsrud. Chris is one of my longest termed friends. I've lost most of my friends over time, but somehow Chris has stayed the course. We've raised kids together. We've hunted together. He used to live in my town, as Bronson would call it, Glasgow. But Chris has moved on up the High Line or down the High Line. I don't know what you'd say, which is Highway 2 in northern Montana.
I would say it's moving on up.
I would say so too. He lives in Havre, Montana. And the reason I wanted to talk to Chris is he's pursuing a dream that I think a lot of listeners, certainly I have, and that is making blades. He's a blade maker. So talk about knife making in general and how you got started in this, Chris.
Knife making 101. Where do I start? So I've hunted and fished my whole life. And I blame this on my grandfather. Going fishing with him, he would always have a different knife for every outing that we had. And I'd ask him, so why do you have this knife today, Grandpa? He's like, well, we're fishing for northern pike. You have to have a good knife for northerns because you got to cut around the Y bones. They're a big meaty fish. Okay, that makes sense. And then the next time we'd be out, we'd be fishing for, let's say, rainbow trout. Well, why do you have that knife today, Grandpa? Well, rainbow trout are generally a smaller, finer fish. You don't want to use such a big knife on them. Just a delicate little knife will work.
Don't use your pike knife on a trout.
Do not use your pike knife on a trout. Exactly. So I blame this on him. I always had to have a different knife for every occasion. And it started to get expensive, to say the least. And so growing up, I married, I have 2 kids. And my wife is always finding new knives in my drawers. She got a little tired of Me, I always, anytime we'd go somewhere on a trip, I'd have to buy a knife to mark the occasion, whether it was Glacier Park, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, you name it. I'd buy a knife to mark the occasion.
So you're a knife obsessive.
I am, yes, obsession of knives.
So was there ever like
So,
a favorite knife or a go-to knife in that collection, or were you always spinning the wheel?
I'm always spinning the wheel. I've always liked Tonto blades for an everyday carry. Just a little lever lock Tonto blade in my pocket. But when I take my backpack and go hunting, I've got 6 or 7 different knives in there. Um, one for, rib cage work, one for, a skinner. I've got one with a gut hook. It's just all over the board. And so I'm getting later on in my life. I'm mid to upper 40s now. And I've always thought to myself that I could probably start making knives, but never really had the time to do it. I've always been busy with work and running kids around and here and there. So earlier this year, I had some free time on my hands and thought, what a better time to try making a knife. There was one knife that I won at a banquet that I really liked. I liked the way it felt in my hand. I liked how it skinned animals. It wasn't a fishing knife. It was definitely a big game skinner. But it always was dull. It was a poorly constructed knife. Lord only knows what kind of steel it is. Yeah, it's probably some Pakistani or some Chinese steel. But anyways, you'd sharpen it up and it'd have a good edge for 30 seconds, not very long.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, I can do a better job on a knife like this. So what I started out with was I was in the tower industry, and I've had these.
What do you mean tower? Like Tower of London?
The Leaning Tower of Pisa, more like it. So, anyway, no, it was steel towers. So I've always had pieces of steel laying around in my garage, thinking I'd use it someday. So I grabbed one of those angled pieces. It was a 1/4 inch thick, and by 12 inches long. I grabbed a grinder and ground out a pattern on there to what I think that knife should look like. It was a very crude outline, let's say. And I just started grinding away on that. And I got to a point where I didn't like that one anymore. So I started over. And I've started over on that knife, I bet 20 times. But I always had the steel to do it. So I finally got one that I liked. Well, the steel was very soft. So reading up on knife making and online, you have to get steel hardened. Well, I had no idea what that was. So I, Googled it on the internet and looked at a bunch of different sites, and came across this gentleman in Georgia that, he would offer to harden steel blades.
So you would just send him blades and he would do the hardening?
Yes. And so there's a cost to that. So you don't want to just send them blade after blade after blade. you want to perfect what you're doing before you start spending money. So on the one that I was working on, which is that little Skinner again, um, I got it ground down to the profile I liked, and then I ground in the bevels, which are the angles of your blade. You can go. What I do now is a 24-degree bevel, and that leaves a lot of spine on the top of the knife for um, to give that knife rigidity.
Mhm.
So I got it to that point using just a hand grinder, a file, and some sandpaper, and got it to that point. And I sent it off to him, and he was amazed at what I had done with just basic hand tools. So that gave me, a pretty big boost. He hardened it for me, and then buffed and polished the steel because I don't have the machines to do that yet. I'm still working with basic hand tools. So I got that back, and um, it's just looking at it. Once you get the steel back, then you got to think of a handle to put on it. And so I got a handle kind of roughed up out of just some cheap wood that I had laying around. Um, so I cut that into shape. I drilled it and put some, just some like 1/8 pins through the handle and epoxied it. And it came out pretty good. So I was showing that knife to my small group of friends. And the one friend said he would like to buy it. It's like, really? You want to buy that? I thought it was pretty crude, but it was the best knife that I'd come up with so far. So I sold it to him, and he was just plumb tickled pink with it. And so that's kind of the start that I had with it. Since then, I've purchased, 1095 steel, 1080. That is a rough
Those are just
bar
metal.
stock. That it's
Explain what those designations mean.
So 1095 and 1080, they have a different carbon content. You want a higher carbon content in a knife that you want to hold an edge. You don't want the carbon content so high because that will make your knife kind of brittle. Not brittle, but not as strong for a hunting knife. So you want a good carbon content, but not so high. So the 1080 and 1095 have a higher carbon content than tower steel.
So are these coming as preformed blade shapes, or are they just blanks that then you have to do all the cutting and shaping?
No, they're just blanks that I do the shaping of. And then once the shaping is done, then they get sent off for hardening again. So it's still with strictly hand tools. Like I said, the file, the grinder, sandpaper for a final grind of that bevel. And so I purchased these bar stocks and then send them off for the heat treating, like I say. And then once I get them back, I put handles on them, or scales, as it's called in the knife community.
So I'm looking here. I've got two of your knives. They're the same model. This little clip
Yes.
point Skinner. Do you have this has got there's two of them. There's one that's got box elder wood handles or scales, as you say,
Yep.
and the other's got Russian olive scales.
Yes.
Is this a pretty?
So
I guess is this the model that you are most proud of, or is there a different kind of blade style that you really are keen on? Get it keen on?
that model is the fingerhole Skinner, which is the first knife I made. But I've
Huh.
between that one and the two that you have, there were probably 50 knives in the middle of there that never saw the light of day. So, because it's easy to take that grinder too far,
Mhm.
just doing them by hand. So,
So what typically results in one that you're just not proud of, or that you toss into the rubbish heap? Like what goes wrong?
so a lot of what goes wrong is either I take a bevel too far on one edge, that's grinding too much, or I make a big gouge across the knife and it leaves, a 16th edge across there, which obviously isn't going to work.
Looking back on your grandfather's sort of collection of knives of different utility types,
Yeah.
is there a knife that you haven't, that you're really looking forward to making, or you have made that you think, is sort of the ultimate expression of your knife making?
So he was a big fan of fillet knives, and I've been trying my hand at that, but they are really tough to make. They obviously need that flexible blade, but still strong enough that they're not going to break. So they still need to have a high carbon content for the flexibility, but need to be strong enough that when you are flexing it, it doesn't break. So I'm still.
Have you had one, a prototype break?
I've had quite a few break on me, yes.
Huh.
And then, so we'll get into this part later, but I give all my steel that I've been working on that doesn't make the final grade. I give that to a friend here in Havre that has a forge, and he throws them in the forge and makes his own knives with them.
Doesn't sound like they're knives I particularly want to have.
the ones of mine that didn't see the light of day.
Yeah.
No, he makes nice knives. So.
Talk to me about the scales, the handles.
Okay.
To me, that's there's two interesting expressions I think of kind of the craft. One is the blade styles, but the other is the handles. And it seems like you've got kind of creative license there to do just lots and lots of different things.
So on the scales, there's many different options for the scales, which are the handle piece. There's hidden tang, which the tang is hidden inside the handle, literally, so you don't see it after the blade. And then there's full tang, which you see that tang coming out, but have a handle or the scales on each side of that. That's basically the two styles, are the hidden and the full tang.
Just a little knife anatomy there. The tang part is what part of the blade?
So the tang of the knife is still the body of the knife, but it's carried out past the blade. So you have your blade bevels, and then the tang is on the rear end of that blade. It's not sharpened. Gotcha. It's still a hardened piece of that knife. So then you can either do the hidden tang or the full tang. But most of what I've done so far is the full tang. So you see that tang coming out, and then you've got scales on either side. I've done a couple hidden tangs, but they're hard to do. So I'm still trying to perfect that. before anybody sees them.
Are they hard to do because you have to basically route out the chamber or the recess for the tang? So,
Right.
for instance, the scales I have, you basically look like you slap them on either side of that butt
Yep.
of the knife so that everything's visible.
So what you have are the full tang version. And you're right, on the hidden tang, you have to route or drill out the center of that handle for that hidden tang to go in. And if you aren't precise on it, that blade is going to flex within that handle.
Sure.
So it's pretty precise to get that hidden tang in there. And I personally like to put a pin through whatever handle material, through that hidden tang and out the other side of the handle. That just gives rigidity to everything. So once you put that pin in and you insert the epoxy, nothing's going to move.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the economy of knife making. You've got a lot of different components that you're buying just in rough. Then you're putting in your time.
Yep.
Maybe talk a little bit about, kind of what the components cost. How many hours go into making a handmade knife?
So that's a really good question. And that's one that I still have to answer fully. On steel that I have laying around the house here, I could easily get 6, 7, 8 hours into a knife, but that's broken up in multiple days. So because there's a lot of work that I have to put into this steel that's not hard, and it's easier to work with, but in the long run, it's easier to build a knife, to go out and purchase that bar stock that comes, you can purchase it in different widths. And this bar stock is relatively inexpensive. It can vary from, $6 to a 12-inch piece. So it's not an expensive part of knife making. It's one that I would like to avoid in the future, but right now that's what I have to do. So once you have the blade material, and then you can start looking at pin stock for the handles. You can look at handle material, which either is bone or antler or the plastics or the acrylics. And those vary in prices from, the cheap acrylics from $3 for a complete set to make a knife, all the way up to hundreds of dollars, depending on what the material is. Some of the exotic woods, like snake wood, some of those, zebra wood isn't super exotic, but they can get pretty expensive. And in my experience, it's really easy to screw up a set of scales or handles just because I don't have, all I have are hand tools.
Sure.
And so when you're cutting out that profile for that handle, it's easy to cut just a little bit too far in where the tang would show too much.
Yeah.
So I have not ventured out and worked with some of those exotic woods yet. I would love to get to that point, but for financial reasons, I have not done that yet.
So I'm interested to hear that the wooden scales need to be pressure treated, and I certainly get that, just to be impervious, probably a little bit more rigid as well. How about antler or bone? Is that impervious enough just as it is, or do you have to do anything to treat that surface so that it doesn't, absorb blood or other environmental materials?
Well, it's a good idea to finish it with, there's multiple liquids out there you can use, but I use what's called linwood, and it's just seals in the porous of that antler material or wood material, and that does a pretty good job because the main goal is to not get bacteria into that handle material. So antler is a really good material to make knife handles with because it's naturally antibacterial. So.
So far we've been talking only about fixed blade knives. Do you have any fancy or interest in folders? And that, I'm guessing, because of the mechanical part of the folding mechanism, has got to be a whole other ball of wax.
I do have, because I've always carried folding knives, and I do not have the machinery to build up, like you say, the mechanics, the locking mechanism and things like that. But out on the World Wide Web, there are many, many companies that will sell you that kit, and then you provide the blade for it. So I have not done that yet because those blades are a lot smaller, a lot more minute details that I haven't done yet. But I plan to go there probably sooner than later.
Let's talk about sheaths, because the sheaths for these, what do you call it? The
finger hole skinner.
What the finger hole skinner? I got the skinner part. I couldn't get the finger hole part. Do you also make the sheaths?
I do not make the sheaths. I source them locally here. There's a boot repair shop here in Havre, Montana, and he does a pretty good job on the sheaths. But I could also custom order them online, which I'd get them for about the same price and quite a bit quicker than what he can provide. But I really like to shop local. I think that's a big thing in this day and age, is supporting the local business.
Before I extol the virtues of this knife on an antelope I skinned with it the other day, one thing I see is there's no sort of marks, whether you're kind of trademark marks or something like that. I think the sheath should have maybe a little signature on it, and it'd be nice if the blade had just a little remark on it. Have you thought about that?
Yes, I have. I've thought about that a lot. And I'm trying to come up with a design that, would capture who I am as a knife maker. And I haven't quite done that yet. And to me, that's the first process, is getting the design made. And then I think what you're referring to is an etching process. And those personal etching machines are quite expensive. So,
yeah.
And I've taught.
What is your company called?
Beartooth Custom Knives. And I came up with the Beartooth because there's a Beartooth mountain range here in Montana that I've hunted quite extensively, and I love that area. So that was a natural pick for me. And I've thought about 9-toe knives, but not everybody would get that. That's a little inside joke.
I don't want to disclose your medical condition, but there might be something personally based about that, Mr. Amputee. Yeah. A couple other questions is, so what do you sell a knife for? Like we talked a little bit about the time and the just investment of raw materials into this. If I was gonna buy this instead of being gifted one by my best friend, what would it cost me?
Well, that's a good question. I made one knife for another guy there in Glasgow, and he was getting it for his stepdaughter because she was doing the Hunter Apprentice program this year, and she's 10 years old. So we picked out a blade pattern that he thought she would like and small enough for her hands. But then I wanted a good, a nice wood pattern for the handle. So I picked up some of that blue dyed box elder burl that you also have, and I used that on a knife for her. And I charged him $120. And so to me, that was a pretty fair price. Going out, and I used a high grade carbon, the 1095 steel for the blade, and that blue dyed box elder burl was a little more expensive than what I've used in the past, but it's a very pretty wood. It just comes out at you, basically.
Yeah, it's got a lot of figure to it.
Those are the words I was looking for. So I think he's happy with it. I haven't heard, and that's the hard part, is you generally don't hear back from the customers. And I wish more would give me feedback so that I know that I'm going down the right path and customers are liking what they're getting. But you just don't hear that.
Well, you're about to hear some feedback on this one. So I skinned my antelope with the box elder. I think actually the handle is a little too big. And you're a big fella. I'm wondering if you scaled the scales for your hand.
I've got extraordinarily large hands.
They're proportionate to your body. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay.
But that's really, really that's it. I thought it held the blade well, or held the edge well. I really like the swoop of it, and the ability to have that finger hole lets you put different kind of torque on the blade as you're working into some of those kind of close quarters for a skinner. So, that's my feedback.
And I would agree with you on that blade design. It's got the roughed up ridge where your thumb can set. So when you have bloody hands, your knife's not slipping in your hands and cutting yourself, which is easy to do if anybody's ever gutted a deer or anything. You're up in there to your elbows, so you want a knife that's steady in your hand.
Up in ya, so they'd say. Up in ya.
Sug up in ya, if Sug is listening.
So,
hey, I thought of something. You'll get one more listener out of this because I'm sure that my mom will listen to it.
Don't be that sure. You
guys need to give yourselves more credit.
So we're going to wrap this up, but is this the sort of thing you feel like you can make a business out of? I think as we started at the introduction, it's a skill a lot of sportsmen imagine themselves doing. Making your own knife is like it's a real goal for a lot of people. Is it something that can sustain you?
Right now, I am my biggest critic. So I go through a lot of pre-knife work before one actually comes to fruition. So for me right now, this is a fun hobby. And yeah, I like other people to see the knives and use the knives, but I wouldn't make a business for myself out of this right now. I would need to save up, and not a lot more money, but, I'd like to have a belt sander, just some tools like that would speed up the process.
Would you ever imagine investing in a kiln?
Yeah, I do. In a forge, that is my end goal, is to be able to take an old car spring or anything. Car springs are great knife making steel. So I'd like to be able to cut a piece out of that and forge it and hammer it into a blade form.
Yeah.
And do everything myself, because then I could heat treat it myself. I could do everything. And that is my end goal, but it's going to take me a while to get there.
Well, meanwhile, keep them coming out. I mean, I'm interested to see. You've got an Instagram feed you can talk about here in just a second, but it's interesting to see as you kind of develop different prototypes and different ideas. And I'm excited for where it can go. I think you do have a good eye and a good talent, and maybe it's to your grandfather's credit that you're avid about knives. Where can people look for more of your blades and blade style?
So, shameless plug here. Beartooth Custom Knives. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. You'll see all the knives on there. So Facebook is Beartooth Custom Knives. That is my business page. I have not started a website yet. I just don't want to take on that expenditure. So right now it's Facebook and Instagram.
I guess the last question is there a knife that you would show your grandfather and say, this is what I can do?
No, not yet. Like I said, I'm my biggest critic, and he really loved his little fine rainbow knives, or the pike fillet knife. I haven't mastered those yet. Once I do, I will show him. I think he would like what I'm doing, but I don't know that I like him enough yet.
Yeah. Well, we will be very interested to see the evolution continue. Thanks for being on Gravel.
Thanks for having me be your first guest. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, there's a lot to aspire to. Well, good. Well, folks, that's it for another episode of On Gravel. We'll be at you again next week. And in the meantime, keep it on gravel.